Dr. Ethan Grant woke with a start, his body jerking upright as the sound of alarms and flashing red lights overwhelmed him. His heart pounded in his chest, and for a moment, he couldn't remember where he was. The sudden jolts and shaking of the spaceship gave him no time to process. He quickly grabbed the nearest control panel, trying to steady himself, but the ship was spiraling out of control. Ethan was on a routine mission to deliver medical supplies to a distant planet. He had never expected something like this to happen. The ship, Aurora, a state-of-the-art spacecraft, had been reliable up until now. But now it was crashing, burning through the sky and heading straight for the surface of an unknown planet. With a final violent jolt, the ship smashed into the ground. Ethan was thrown from his seat, his head striking the dashboard with a sharp pain. The world around him spun, and everything went dark. When Ethan finally regained consciousness, he was in a daze. His head throbbed, and his body ached all over. The air was thick and warm, unlike the sterile atmosphere of the Aurora. He groaned, struggling to open his eyes. The smell of burning metal mixed with the unfamiliar scent of something sweet and earthy. The sound of distant animal calls echoed from outside. He took a deep breath and pushed himself up. His eyes darted around. The ship's cockpit was a wreck, debris and metal fragments scattered everywhere. He stumbled out of his seat, careful not to step on anything sharp. The outside was quiet, save for the rustling of leaves and a strange breeze that carried a sense of unfamiliarity. As he made his way toward the entrance, his feet barely moved, the world swaying with every step. When Ethan stepped outside, he was greeted by an overwhelming sight. The land was alien, unlike anything he had ever seen in his life. Tall, spindly trees with purple leaves stretched toward the sky. The sky itself was a hazy blue, filled with two moons hanging low. The ground was covered with soft, glowing grass that seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. Ethan's mind raced. He had no idea where he was. The ship was destroyed, and there was no communication system left. He was completely stranded. His first instinct was to search for other survivors, but he already knew the truth. He had been the only one in the cockpit when the ship crashed. As he stumbled through the wreckage, Ethan heard a noise, something moving. His heart skipped a beat as he turned toward the sound, eyes narrowing. In the distance, hidden behind a tree, he saw movement. It was humanoid, tall and slender. Someone, or something, was watching him. Before he could react, a figure stepped out into the open. She was tall, with skin a shade of deep blue, and her eyes glowed with an otherworldly light. She was dressed in a form-fitting outfit of metallic material that shimmered like stardust. The creature, or alien, was unlike anything he had ever seen. Her gaze was steady, sharp, and intense as she looked him over. Ethan froze, not sure whether to run or to speak. The alien woman tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them moved. They simply stared at each other in the strange alien world, both unsure of what to do next. The silence hung in the air before she finally spoke. "You are not from here," she said in a voice that sounded both calm and curious. Ethan swallowed hard. "I'm not," he replied, still stunned. "My name is Dr. Ethan Grant. I don't know where I am." The alien woman's eyes softened slightly. "You are far from home, human." And so, their unlikely journey began. Ethan stood frozen, his mind racing as he tried to process everything. The alien woman before him was unlike any being he had ever encountered, her appearance stunning and intimidating all at once. Her eyes glowed with an ethereal light, a hue he had never seen before, and her posture was regal, as though she belonged to some ancient, powerful race. He didn't know what to say. Every word that came to his mind felt wrong, too simple, too human. She tilted her head, studying him with curiosity, but there was a coldness behind her gaze that made Ethan uneasy. She wasn't hostile, but she wasn't friendly either. After a long silence, she spoke again. "You are lucky to be alive, human," she said, her voice smooth but carrying an air of authority. "The crash was violent. Your survival is improbable." Ethan nodded, his mouth dry. "Yeah, I guess. But where are we? What planet is this?" The alien's expression softened slightly, though there was still an underlying wariness in her eyes. "This is Kalath, a world that was once rich with life. Now it is just a memory, a place abandoned by most." Kalath. Ethan repeated the name, committing it to memory. He glanced around at the alien landscape, still in awe. "I don't understand. How did you get here?" She didn't answer immediately, her gaze shifting to the wreckage of the ship. Ethan followed her eyes and winced. The Aurora, his vessel, was beyond repair. There was no way to contact anyone, no way to get help. The reality of his situation hit him like a wave, and a sense of helplessness washed over him. He was stranded on an alien world with no way out, and no one would even know he was gone. His thoughts were interrupted by the alien woman's voice. "I can help you," she said suddenly. Ethan blinked, surprised. "You can? How?" The alien stepped closer, her movements graceful yet deliberate. "I know this world better than anyone," she said, her voice steady and calm. "I can help you survive, but you must trust me." He hesitated. Trust her? He barely knew her, and yet she was offering her help. She could be leading him into a trap. But then again, what choice did he have? He didn't have any other option. "Okay," he said finally, his voice steady despite the confusion and fear swirling inside him. "I'll trust you." The alien woman gave him a slight nod, her expression unreadable. "Wise choice," she murmured. She then motioned for him to follow her. Without another word, she led Ethan through the strange alien terrain. The landscape was wild and uncharted, filled with towering plants that seemed to hum with life. The air was thick, the atmosphere humid and heavy, but oddly comforting. Ethan was careful to stay close, not wanting to get lost in this foreign world. As they walked, the alien woman spoke more about Kalath. She explained that it had once been a thriving planet with advanced civilizations, but a catastrophic event had led to its downfall. Now most of the population was gone, and only a few remained, isolated and broken. "I am one of the last," she said. "The survivors are few. We keep to ourselves, away from outsiders. We have no desire for contact." Ethan listened carefully, his mind whirring with questions. "So why are you here, if you don't want to make contact?" The alien paused, glancing at him over her shoulder. "I was sent to find something," she said cryptically. "And now I find myself with you." "Something?" Ethan asked, his curiosity piqued. She didn't answer, and the silence between them grew heavy. He wanted to ask more, but he knew better than to push her. She was giving him enough for now. As they moved deeper into the wilderness, Ethan couldn't help but wonder what her true intentions were. Was she really just offering help? Or was there something more behind her actions? He didn't know, but for now, he had no choice but to rely on her. When they reached a clearing, she stopped and gestured for him to sit. "We will rest here. Tomorrow, we search for food and shelter. The journey will be long." Ethan nodded, settling down on the soft, glowing grass. He was exhausted, both physically and mentally, but there was a flicker of hope within him. He might be stranded, but he wasn't alone anymore, and for the first time since the crash, he allowed himself to relax, even if just for a moment. The alien woman, standing in the shadows, watched him carefully, her gaze distant and unreadable. She had her own reasons for helping him, but for now, they shared a common goal: to survive. And in this alien world, that was enough. The night was quiet, but it wasn't peaceful. The alien sky above them was filled with strange, swirling colors, like an endless canvas of distant lights and floating shapes. Ethan stared up at it, trying to make sense of the world around him. He had never thought he would be in a place like this, on an alien planet with no way to communicate with Earth. His mind kept circling back to his crash. His ship was gone. There was no way to fix it, no way to contact anyone. The alien woman had told him to rest, but sleep didn't come easily. Instead, he watched the strange sky, listening to the low hum of the plants around him. It felt alive, almost as if the world itself was whispering secrets. A soft rustling noise pulled Ethan from his thoughts. The alien woman was sitting a little distance away, her glowing eyes scanning the dark. He had learned her name was Nora, though she spoke little about herself. He didn't press her, yet. After all, they were allies for now, and it was better to keep the peace. After a long silence, Nora finally spoke. Her voice, even in the quiet night, held power. "You have questions, I know." Ethan nodded, not wanting to break the fragile trust that had begun to form between them. "Yeah, I do. I don't understand. Why are you helping me? Why take the risk?" She turned her gaze toward him. Her eyes gleamed in the dark, sharp and intelligent. "You are not like the others," she said simply. "You are different." Ethan frowned, unsure if he should feel flattered or worried. Different? How? Naira's lips barely moved when she spoke, her tone almost lost in the wind. "The others, the ones I have met, they are greedy, selfish. Your kind, are capable of much more." His confusion grew, but he decided to wait. Naira wasn't one to explain everything at once. He knew he had to be patient. She continued, her voice soft but clear. "I have seen many worlds. I have met many species. Most of them are not interested in helping. They only take what they can and leave destruction in their wake. But you are different." Ethan sat up straighter, trying to make sense of what she was saying. "You think humans are capable of more. Of what exactly?" She shifted her weight and stared into the night. "Your species has the ability to create, to build, but you are also capable of destruction. However, I see potential in you. I see that you can choose to help, to change things, even when it seems impossible." Ethan was struck by her words. "But how do you know that? How do you know what humans are capable of?" Naira looked at him then, her glowing eyes sharp and intense. "I have watched. I have seen what happens when your kind work together. When they choose to fight for something greater than themselves. I have seen humanity rise, and I have seen it fall. But I believe you can rise again." Ethan couldn't help but wonder what she meant by that. Was she talking about the fall of Earth, or something else? He didn't know if he believed her completely, but the way she spoke made him want to believe it. She had seen things, experienced things that he couldn't even begin to understand. For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of her words hanging in the air between them. Ethan's mind began to race. What was she truly offering him? Was she just a survivor of her own world, or was there something more to Naira's story? He wasn't sure, but one thing was certain. He couldn't let his guard down entirely. Not yet. Naira broke the silence again, her voice steady. "Tomorrow, we begin the journey. The caves are far. But there, we may find something that can help us survive longer." Ethan nodded. He was exhausted but knew sleep would be pointless. His mind was too full of questions. Still, he had no choice but to trust her for now. As the fire crackled between them, he glanced at Naira. She was no longer the intimidating figure she had seemed when they first met. Now she was a companion, someone who, though mysterious, was offering him the chance of survival in this strange alien world. Ethan had no idea what lay ahead, but he knew one thing. In this place, on this foreign planet, he would need Naira just as much as she needed him. Together, they would have to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The morning light broke through the alien trees, casting an eerie glow over the strange landscape. Ethan sat up, rubbing his eyes, the exhaustion from the previous day still lingering in his body. Naira was already up, moving with the quiet grace of someone used to surviving in harsh environments. Her movements were fluid, almost predatory. It was a strange thing to witness, especially knowing she was an alien and not human. But over the past few days, Ethan had started to accept her presence beside him. She wasn't an enemy. At least, not anymore. He watched her for a moment, wondering how much she had seen in her life, how much she had been through. In her eyes, he had seen both pain and hope. The two emotions seemed to exist in a delicate balance, one he could understand, but one he was unsure how to navigate. "What's the plan today?" Ethan asked, standing up and stretching his stiff muscles. His body ached from the crash and the rough terrain, but there was no time to waste. They needed a way off this planet. Nira paused, glancing over her shoulder as she gathered a small bag. "We travel to the caves. I believe they hold something that could help us. But we must be cautious." Her tone was serious, the weight of her words sinking into Ethan's chest. It wasn't just the planet that was dangerous. It was everything here, every step they took, every breath they drew. Ethan nodded. "I'm ready." Nira led the way, her footsteps confident as she moved through the alien jungle. Ethan followed, trying his best to match her pace. The air was thick with humidity, the sounds of strange creatures echoing in the distance. He couldn't help but feel like they were being watched, but Nira didn't seem to mind. She had lived here for who knew how long. She knew what to expect. They walked for hours, the jungle stretching endlessly around them. Strange, glowing plants dotted the landscape, their bioluminescent colors casting an otherworldly glow over everything. Ethan marveled at the beauty of it all, but there was little time to appreciate it. They had a goal. As they reached a clearing, Nira stopped suddenly. Her sharp eyes scanned the area, and Ethan followed her gaze. The ground ahead of them was cracked open, leading into a dark abyss. The caves. "This is it," Nira said, her voice low. "We have to be careful. These caves are not just home to creatures. They hold secrets. We don't know what we'll find inside." Ethan felt a rush of fear, but he hid it well. He wasn't afraid of the dark. He was afraid of the unknown. He didn't know what lay ahead, didn't know if they would find a way to survive, or if they would meet their end here. Together, they descended into the cave. The air was cool, and the walls were damp, but the quiet was almost deafening. Ethan felt the weight of it pressing against him. He could hear Nira's steady breathing ahead of him, but everything else felt so still. He tried to focus on his footsteps, trying to keep his thoughts from spiraling. As they walked deeper into the cave, the walls began to glow faintly. The light grew stronger, and Ethan saw what Nira had meant. The walls were covered in strange symbols, etched into the rock with care. They didn't look like anything he'd ever seen before. "What do you think this is?" Ethan asked, his voice barely a whisper. Nira stopped and studied the symbols. She touched the walls gently, tracing the lines with her fingers. "This is part of an ancient language," she said. "My people. We used to communicate like this. These symbols could be the key to something important." Ethan's heart quickened. This was it, the clue they had been searching for. Whatever this was, it could hold the answer to getting off this planet. He felt a glimmer of hope, something he hadn't felt in days. But as he took a step closer, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The cave ahead of them was not empty. There were shadows, large, shifting figures. Something was moving in the dark. Nira froze, her body tense. She reached out and grabbed Ethan's arm, pulling him back. "Stay quiet," she whispered. Ethan's heart raced. What were these creatures? Were they friendly? Or were they deadly? The shadows shifted again, and suddenly, Ethan realized they weren't alone. The cave was alive, full of hidden dangers, and they had just walked into the heart of it. Ethan could feel the tension in the air as he and Nira stood frozen in the cave's dim light. The shadows in front of them shifted again, and the eerie silence of the cave was broken only by the sounds of their breathing. Ethan could feel his pulse quicken. The creatures in the shadows were closer now, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He had no idea what was lurking just beyond the flickering light. Nera's grip on his arm tightened. Her sharp eyes were fixed on the shadows, her body still and tense, like a predator ready to strike. Ethan couldn't help but admire her composure in the face of what seemed like a certain danger. "Stay close to me," she whispered, her voice low and steady. Ethan nodded, swallowing his fear. "What are they?" he asked, trying to keep his voice from shaking. "Predators," Nera replied, her voice tight with caution. "But not the kind you know. These creatures are territorial. They won't attack unless they feel threatened." Ethan's mind raced. The last thing he wanted was to provoke whatever these things were. His heart pounded as he took a slow step back, trying not to make a sound. Nera moved with him, her movements fluid and calculated. They crept deeper into the cave, the shadows watching them every step of the way. The creatures didn't seem to follow, but their presence was unsettling. The walls of the cave grew narrower, the air heavier with each passing moment. As they rounded a corner, Nera held up a hand to stop him. She squatted down beside a stone, carefully lifting it to reveal something beneath. Ethan leaned in, trying to see what she had found. A glowing object rested inside, a strange, crystalline shard. It pulsed with an otherworldly light, casting long shadows across the cave's walls. Nera's eyes widened as she carefully took the shard in her hands, examining it with intense focus. "This is it," she whispered to herself. "This is the key to everything." Ethan watched her closely. "What is it?" Nera looked up, her gaze sharp. "This crystal is a piece of ancient technology. My people used these to power ships, to communicate across vast distances. It could be our way off this planet." Hope stirred within Ethan's chest. For the first time in days, he could see a way out. He didn't know how they were going to get back to the ship, but this crystal, this strange piece of technology, could be their ticket home. Before he could ask more questions, a loud screech echoed through the cave. The ground shook beneath their feet. Ethan's heart jumped in his chest. The predators were getting closer. Nera quickly tucked the crystal into a pouch on her belt, her expression hardening. "We need to move now." Without a second thought, Ethan followed Nera as she led the way deeper into the cave, her footsteps sure and swift. They didn't speak, each of them focused on the task at hand, surviving. The cave became a maze, twisting and turning in every direction. The walls narrowed even further, and Ethan had to duck and squeeze through narrow passages to keep up with Nera. The distant screeches of the predators continued to echo in the tunnels, sending a chill down his spine. They finally reached an opening in the cave, a small chamber with a high ceiling. Nera paused to catch her breath, her eyes scanning the surroundings. She motioned for Ethan to stay close. "Stay quiet," she murmured. "This is the safest place for now." Ethan nodded, his body tense. He didn't dare speak, afraid that any noise would bring the predators closer. The light from the glowing crystal illuminated the chamber in soft hues, casting strange, shifting shadows across the walls. Nera crouched down to examine the ground, brushing aside the dust. She paused, her brow furrowing. "There's something here," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Something buried." Ethan stepped closer, curiosity getting the best of him. He knelt down beside Nera, who was already digging with her hands. After a few moments, she pulled free a strange metallic object from the ground. It was shaped like a cylinder, covered in intricate markings. Ethan's eyes widened. "Is this more technology?" Nera nodded, her fingers tracing the markings on the cylinder. "Yes, this could be the final piece of the puzzle. Together with the crystal, this may allow us to send a signal, to call for help." Hope surged in Ethan's chest, but the reality of their situation set in. They were still stranded on an alien planet, surrounded by dangerous creatures, with only their wits and Nera's knowledge to guide them. The danger wasn't over. Nera stood up, clutching both the crystal and the mysterious cylinder. She turned to Ethan, her gaze filled with determination. "We're not out of the woods yet, but were one step closer to finding a way home. Ethan nodded, ready for whatever came next. Whatever dangers lay ahead, he would face them with Nira. Together, they would survive. Ethan's heart raced as he watched Nira carefully place the glowing crystal and the strange cylinder into her pack. They had found something important, but they were still trapped on this alien planet, and the predators were closing in. Every sound seemed to echo louder in the tense silence of the cave. "We need to leave now," Nira said, her voice calm but urgent. She turned and started moving, her eyes sharp, scanning the darkness ahead. Ethan hesitated for a moment, looking at the jagged rocks around them. The ground was uneven, the air thick with dust, and every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Yet Nira was moving without fear, her focus on their next steps. He took a deep breath and followed her, keeping close. The sound of their footsteps echoed softly against the walls, mingling with the distant screeches of the predators still lurking somewhere in the shadows. Ethan didn't know how far they had come, but he could feel the weight of exhaustion beginning to drag him down. They had been walking for hours, and the constant pressure of survival had worn on him. He could only hope they were getting closer to safety. Nira led the way with purpose, navigating the twisting tunnels as if she had been here before. Ethan had no idea how she knew the cave system so well, but he trusted her. She was their guide in this strange world, and without her, he would have been lost long ago. After what felt like an eternity, they reached another narrow passage. Nira stopped suddenly, her hand up to signal Ethan to remain quiet. The sound of movement reached their ears, slow, deliberate steps coming from the darkness. Ethan tensed, his eyes darting around the shadows. He held his breath, willing himself to stay calm. The predators were close. Nira crouched low, her movements smooth and practiced. Ethan followed her lead, keeping his body pressed against the cave wall. The passage ahead was barely wide enough for them to squeeze through, and Ethan's heart beat faster as he imagined the creatures on the other side. Suddenly, the ground rumbled beneath them, and a loud growl echoed through the cave. Ethan's pulse quickened, and he glanced nervously at Nira. Her face was calm, but her eyes were focused, studying the tunnel ahead. She knew they didn't have much time before the predators would be upon them. Nira nodded toward a narrow crack in the wall. "We can hide there." Without waiting for a response, she moved swiftly toward the crack. Ethan followed, his breath shallow as he squeezed into the small space beside her. The crack barely fit both of them, but they had no choice but to wait in the dark, holding their breaths as the predators drew closer. The sound of their footsteps grew louder, echoing down the tunnel. Ethan's mind raced, praying they wouldn't be discovered. The creatures were terrifying, and the idea of facing them in the confined space of the cave filled him with dread. Minutes passed like hours. Ethan could feel his body aching from the cramped position, but he dared not move. Nira remained still beside him, her expression unreadable. She had been in situations like this before. She knew how to survive. Finally, the footsteps faded into the distance. Nira exhaled softly, and Ethan let out the breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The immediate danger had passed, but they both knew it wasn't over. The predators could still be waiting just around the corner. "Let's go," Nira whispered, motioning for him to follow. They emerged from the crack and continued down the tunnel, their steps slow but determined. The silence around them was oppressive, but they couldn't afford to stop. As they moved deeper into the cave system, Ethan's thoughts returned to the mysterious crystal and cylinder they had found. This was their only hope of escape. If they could figure out how to use them, they could call for help. But what if they were too late? What if no one came in time? Nira's voice broke through his thoughts. "We're almost there," she said, her eyes scanning the darkness ahead. Her words brought a spark of hope to his heart. He had been lost in his fears for too long. They weren't finished yet. They had survived this far together, and they could make it out. The tunnel ahead opened up into a wider chamber. Nira stepped forward, scanning the area for any signs of danger. Ethan followed, his eyes darting around the unfamiliar space. It was unlike the other parts of the cave they had explored. A vast, open room with strange, glowing markings on the walls. Nira knelt down, studying the symbols. "This is it," she said, her voice filled with awe. "This is an ancient control room. If we can activate the system, we can send a signal to the ship." Ethan's heart leaped at the possibility. How do we activate it? Nira's fingers traced the symbols on the wall. "I can't read all of it, but I know enough. These markings are similar to those in the control rooms on my ship. I think I can make it work." Ethan's pulse raced as the growls of the predators grew louder in the cave. He could feel the air growing heavy, thick with the promise of danger. Nira's hands moved swiftly over the glowing symbols on the ancient stone wall, her face focused but pale from exhaustion. She was trying to activate the ship's distress signal, but time was running out. "We don't have much time," Ethan said, his voice tight. He turned around, eyes darting through the dim light of the cave, every shadow feeling like a threat. "I know," Nira replied, not looking up. "I'm almost there." Behind them, the sounds of the predator's approach echoed through the dark tunnels, their footsteps growing closer. The creatures, huge with glowing red eyes, had been tracking them for days. They were relentless. Nira's fingers hovered over a panel, and with a quick motion, she pressed it. A soft hum filled the room, followed by a sudden pulse of light. The ship's distress signal had activated. Ethan exhaled in relief, but before he could speak, the ground trembled under their feet. The predators were nearly upon them. "We can't wait," Ethan said urgently. He grabbed Nira's arm. "We have to run." Nira nodded, grabbing the pack with the crystal and cylinder. She didn't need to say anything. Together, they bolted toward the cave's exit. The narrow passageways twisted ahead, but Nira led the way, knowing the terrain better than Ethan. Behind them, the growls and hisses of the creatures echoed like a death march. Ethan's breath grew heavy as they sprinted through the winding tunnels. His legs burned, but he pushed forward, knowing that they had no choice. If they didn't escape now, they were done for. Suddenly, Nira stopped, her body stiff with tension. Ethan barely managed to halt in time before crashing into her. He looked ahead and froze. The predators had found them. A group of massive creatures stood at the far end of the chamber, their glowing eyes fixed on the two humans. Ethan's heart sank. The creatures were blocking the only exit. Nira stepped in front of him, her expression grim but determined. "Stay back, Ethan," she said quietly. "I'll handle this." Ethan opened his mouth to protest, but Nira was already moving. In her hand, the energy blade, one of her ship's weapons, appeared with a snap of her fingers. The blade crackled with power, glowing brightly in the dim cave. "You need to stay safe," she said, her voice steady, unwavering. "I can take care of this." Ethan's stomach twisted with worry, but he nodded, stepping back. He had seen Nira fight before. She was incredible, but still, the fear gnawed at him. He couldn't lose her. Without hesitation, Nira charged at the closest predator. Her blade moved with terrifying speed, slicing through the air, striking the creature down before it could react. The predator collapsed with a scream, but others quickly took its place. The cave seemed to fill with the noise of the creatures closing in, their red eyes glowing in the dark. The ground shook as they moved, massive bodies threatening to crush everything in their path. Nira didn't stop. She danced around the predators, striking fast, leaving glowing arcs of energy with each movement. Ethan watched, frozen in awe. Nira was a force of nature. Each strike was calculated, perfect. But as the creatures closed in, the odds began to shift. Nira was relentless, but the room was full of enemies now. They were being surrounded. Ethan couldn't just stand there. He grabbed a sharp rock from the cave floor and hurled it at one of the predators, hitting it in the head. The creature howled in rage, turning toward him. "Nira!" Ethan shouted, but it was too late. The predator lunged at him. Time seemed to slow down. Ethan grabbed a piece of metal, swinging it with everything he had. The predator staggered back, momentarily stunned, but another charged at him. Then, a loud roar echoed from outside the cave. It was a ship. Someone had heard the distress signal. The predators hesitated, momentarily distracted by the sound. That was all Nira needed. She moved in, taking down the last of the creatures with a powerful strike. Breathing heavily, she turned to Ethan. "We made it." Together, they turned to face the ship that was now descending from the sky. Their ordeal had been long, but they had survived. They had done it together.